Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 2. The impetus for this series of podcasts on post-Mormonism and this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis is to offer the intellectual and spiritual equivalent of a post-Mormon inoculation. However, one dose or shot in the arm will not do, as we have determined that the best way to safeguard your family is with a double dose or twofold approach. As an example of Latter-day Saints being pressured into choosing between two contrary and polarizing historicities, consider the fact that when it comes to the life of Joseph Smith and to Mormonism's historical origins, that we have two strategically different starting points. For instance, Mormon historicity, with its one-sided and faith-promoting narrative, holds that the best way to understand the life of Joseph Smith and Mormonism's origins is to begin with Joseph Smith's New England heritage, suggesting to one's mind all that is good about America and its origins, the Pilgrims, America's founding, religious freedom, political liberty, and the rationality of the Enlightenment. Post-Mormon historicity, on the other hand, with its one-sided and faith-pouncing narrative, insists that the best way to understand the life of Joseph Smith and Mormonism's origins is not to begin with Joseph Smith's New England heritage, but rather with tales of Captain Kidd and treasure hunting, suggesting to one's mind all that is nefarious in this dark and shady business: folk magic, spirit guardians, peepstones, money-digging schemes, fraud, blackguards, and charlatans. The point is that with the advent of the internet and social media, the traditional approach that called for us to simply stick with the positive and faith-promoting narratives and stay away from all the negative and faith-pouncing narratives simply is no longer going to suffice. Again, it is these two contrary and polarizing historical narratives that is giving rise to the cognitive and spiritual dissonance that eventuates in this latter-day faith crisis. The question then arises that if this traditional twofold strategy is no longer a viable option in warding off the faith-pouncing narratives of post-Mormonism, then how do we in our day safeguard our families from the faith-shattering materials and rhetoric in this high-tech information age? It is our argument that the best way to inoculate or safeguard our families from a post-Mormon-induced faith crisis is with the intellectual and spiritual equivalent of a post-Mormon inoculation, an inoculation that consists in a double dose or twofold approach. Here's a preview of what these two doses will consist in. The first dose, or shot in the arm, will begin with an intense and clear understanding or unmasking of post-Mormonism as a faith crisis and anti-Mormon cultural movement. This will be followed up with a second dose, or shot in the arm, on understanding historicity as an academic discipline. The point is that this double shot in the arm is necessary because without unmasking post-Mormonism, one will remain at risk of this red pilling and the oncoming faith crisis. Likewise, without a basic understanding of historicity as an academic discipline, we will also be at risk of this red pilling for the simple reason that one cannot truly understand post-Mormonism, post-Mormon historicity, or even one's own historicity without a basic understanding of the relationship between historical facts and historical narratives, as well as the part that the inferences drawn, the theories developed, and the judgments made play in the composition of these various historical narratives. It is not enough for Latter-day Saints to simply read or familiarize themselves with the various faith-promoting books on Mormon history. We Latter-day Saints must become amateur historians, and by this I mean that historicity itself as a discipline must be understood, viewing history as the study of past events, particularly in human affairs, and historicity as the historical authenticity of characters and events in history as opposed to legend or myth. Among members of the Church, this double-dose approach may not be the traditional way of handling and distancing oneself from anti-Mormon material and rhetoric, but we believe this new twofold approach of unmasking post-Mormonism and understanding historicity will prove to be by far the most effective and beneficial. In any event, we will devote the entire next episode to the task of unmasking post-Mormonism and we'll follow that up with 1 or 2 episodes on understanding historicity. Given the pivotal role that cognitive dissonance plays in what I have referred to as a post-Mormon-induced faith crisis, then this perhaps would be an opportune time to insert a few slides in an effort to cover this important concept. Let's begin with the definition. In the field of psychology, cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values, and is typically experienced as psychological stress when they participate in an action that goes against one or more of them. According to this theory, when 2 actions or ideas are not psychologically consistent with each other, people do all in their power to change them until they become consistent. We see then that it is this disconnect or clash between one's beliefs and one's behavior that gives rise to the psychological stress and unsettling discomfort that we are calling cognitive dissonance. For instance, if I've come to believe or see myself as an honest and trustworthy person, and yet when it comes to my behavior, I still go out at night robbing stores and stealing jewelry, then this disconnect will give rise to this cognitive dissonance. At this point, if one is rational and still has a conscience, then the stress and discomfort associated with this cognitive dissonance triggers a moral or psychological crisis that demands a resolution in order to reduce the dissonance. This can happen in one of 2 ways. I can change my belief in that I no longer see myself as an honest and trustworthy person, or I can change my behavior in that I quit going out at night robbing stores and stealing jewelry. The first alternative accepts the moral fact that one is a thief, aligning one's belief with one's behavior. The second alternative aligns one's belief that one is an honest and trustworthy person with one's behavior. The moral crisis attempts to bridge the gap between this experience of cognitive dissonance and reducing that dissonance, and which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how it is resolved. Now consider this example. If I've come to believe or see Joseph Smith as a fraud and a scoundrel, and yet when it comes to my behavior, I still go to church, teach Sunday school, and pay my tithing, then this disconnect will give rise to this cognitive dissonance. At this point, if one is rational and still has a conscience, then the stress and discomfort associated with this cognitive dissonance triggers a moral or psychological crisis that demands a resolution in order to reduce the dissonance. This can happen in one of 2 ways. I can change my belief in that I reject the CES letter and believe Joseph Smith to be a prophet of God, or I can change my behavior in that I quit church and seek spiritual fulfillment and meaning elsewhere. The first alternative aligns one's belief with one's behavior, while the second alternative aligns one's behavior with one's beliefs. In short, it aligns one's post-Mormon belief with one's post-Mormon behavior. In this case, however, it is more of a faith than a moral crisis which attempts to bridge the gap between this experience of cognitive dissonance and reducing that dissonance, and which, again, may or may not be a good thing, depending on how it is resolved and whether or not the truth has not been lost or distorted in the midst of this faith crisis. As one can see then, it is this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis which attempts to create a bridge between Mormonism and post-Mormonism. The first step is to induce this cognitive dissonance, and then the second step is to reduce this cognitive dissonance by the individual member or perhaps the entire family resigning their membership in the church. This 2-step strategy of post-Mormonism, to first induce and then reduce this cognitive dissonance, is all part of a larger 7-point red pilling strategy. Let me explain. This post-Mormon 7-point red pilling strategy begins with the attempted debunking of a truth claim. This unsettling disconnect between one's newly acquired belief and one's old behaviors creates the cognitive dissonance that gives rise to this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis. One then sets out to reduce the psychological stress and unsettling discomfort of this cognitive dissonance by resigning one's membership and quitting the church. This is the pivotal midpoint wherein the bridge has been sadly crossed between Mormonism and post-Mormonism, and one's testimony has been lost, at which point it is suggested that one join a post-Mormon support group to help in the transition. This is followed up with ongoing requests for financial support and with the added encouragement to speak up and speak out by sharing one's own personal resignation story with the rest of the world on the Mormon Stories podcast, or by means of other social media avenues or platforms. Notice, however, that this cognitive dissonance all begins with post-Mormon's attempted debunking of a foundational truth claim of the Church. For example, when one considers the cognitive dissonance created by these two contrary and polarizing historical narratives, with Mormon historicity portraying Joseph Smith as a prophet of God, and post-Mormon historicity portraying Joseph Smith as a money-digging fraud, one can begin to see how the attempted debunking of foundational truth claims of the Church are ground zero for this entire post-Mormon faith crisis movement. So with that understanding, we are now ready to take seriously this twofold task of unmasking post-Mormonism and gaining an understanding of historicity as an academic discipline. Before ending this episode, let us once more put a plug in for our course on eternalism by encouraging you to visit our website at christianeternalism.org. Elder Witzel writes, "The gospel may be said to be the philosophy of eternalism. It is the philosophy that explains the whole of man's relationship to the universe. It invites the deepest study and the severest scrutiny." Elsewhere he writes, "In religion, thinkers must have their feet upon the ground," meaning that what is wanted is a reality or fact-based religion, and not a religion or historicity built upon conjectures, myths, or fraudulent claims that cannot be substantiated by truth seekers in search of scientific, historical, and religious truth. Again, to exchange error for truth is the call of Mormonism.